It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote this morning, Maryann Davidson. She's the Chief Security Officer of Oracle. As a day job, that's what she does, and she has, in her past, had various positions, also the government. She's actually, and I need to read this off here, she's part of the Center for Strategic and International Studies Cyber Commission for the 44th President. But how I got to know her is not really necessarily in the security community, but on a surfboard. Maryann is an avid surfer, and whenever she comes out to California, you will most likely see her riding the waves somewhere and not somewhere in an office out there. As soon as the AV works here. Exactly. Right.
Thank you, and I just do want to give you the surf report. We're not missing anything back in California. It's terrible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about assurance and governance. And some of you who may have heard me speak before, I do tend to talk about assurance. My remit at Oracle actually isn't operational security. We have plenty of other wonderful, capable people who look after our networks. But it's product focused because obviously Oracle is an extremely large and getting larger all the time a software vendor, now also hardware with Sun. And effectively, if security, as all of you know, I'm preaching to the converted, is not engineered into your products, you don't really have a snowball's chance in hell of securing it ex post facto, but also we run our business on our software. So I'm focused primarily on product security. And most of that initially was is and still on assurance, but as we've gotten to be a bigger company, this construct of having a more formal and consistent approach to assurance across our lines of business has become very important. So that's pretty much what I'm going to talk about. So, why, it's something we don't actually think about necessarily directly, but software vulnerabilities actually can affect what we think of as more the traditional governance structure. How do you show you're in compliance with regulatory requirements, for example? And particularly software vulnerabilities can damage your IT structure, your reputation, the amount of money you would spend fixing it. We had a little discussion at breakfast this morning about one of the things that's kind of disturbing to me as a vendor. There are a number of people who like to give talks on how the economic model is flawed, that no one's incented to build good software. And I really think that's kind of not really very true for a lot of reasons. First of all, most of the large vendors run their own businesses on their own software. So if you didn't do a very good job, you're going to pay for it yourself directly because your IT department is going to have to be fixing your own software because you didn't do a good job building it. And second of all, it's also process manufacturing. So most people know from process manufacturing, if you have any economic sense at all, you look at, well, what does it cost us to remediate defects after we ship product? Well, I have to put out a bunch of patches, and I have to take scarce engineering resources I could be using on building new features that I could charge for, instead fixing old stuff, which I don't get to charge for. So that's an opportunity cost of those resources, not to mention the amount of money you spend fixing your own engineering, your own IT structure. So it can actually be a very significant cost if you didn't develop your software with any type of assurance in mind. But also to the degree that vulnerabilities are exploitable, it affects your actual governance, such as someone could corrupt your own systems internally, misuse the software to do things that your policies don't otherwise allow, make it so that the people who did that can vanish. There is an insider threat, and it can actually put you out of compliance with particular laws. And as I mentioned, there is a special consideration for software vendors and probably hardware vendors as well, because it's not just what you build, it's what you're running your businesses on. And in ways that we didn't even think about. So for example, we build ERP systems, we run our own business on our ERP systems, but all those other structures that you use even to build the software are also software based. So for example, the source control system. Well, why does that matter? Because if you didn't, if those systems aren't patched, they aren't maintained, they weren't built robustly, someone in the worst case could walk off with your core intellectual property. That would be bad. And thus put your core intellectual property at risk. The ripple effect of software as a service. And what do I mean by that? Everybody, the new hot thing, I guess, is cloud. And most of us understand the value of service offerings. You can pay people to do things that you don't have the expertise to do for yourself, and it might be cheaper and better for them to do it. The difficulty, or one of the difficulties with software as a service, is multi-tenancy. Well, what do I mean by that? And as I tell developers when I'm talking to them about why engineering, building software correctly is important, bad is if there's a defect in our software and a customer's systems get breached. Worse is there's a defect in our software and a customer's system gets breached while we're hosting it for them. Worst of all possible worlds. Defect in software, not only one customer's system gets breached, but multiple because it's multi-tenancy. So the great jumping off point where people have go from concern about assurance to, oh my God, about assurance is multi-tenancy. So if you didn't get it right, the chickens truly come home to roost in a very bad way in that particular in a software as a service where we're trying to have multiple tenants in the same instance. Defect management is obviously a sensitive area because we all know that you can't, no one really wants, in an ironic way, wants to be known as the people who really fix security defects well. So in a weird way, as a vendor, you don't want to get too good at bug handling and vulnerability remediation. And yet, if you don't do it properly, and everyone does have bugs, and some of them are security bugs, that is the thing that will get you in trouble the fastest in a lot of ways, because you didn't fix something properly, or because you sat on something for 3 years and didn't fix it and it turned out to be serious. So it has a significant impact on customers if you don't do that correctly. And in particular, as more and more businesses become regulated, the burden of that comes back on you as a supplier to not only do more in terms of engineering your software, to be more Johnny on the spot if you have to correct something, because it will put one of your customers out of compliance. So what has Oracle's goals been? I'm really happy to say that one of the things that isn't unusual anymore is that almost all the large vendors that you deal with have some sort of assurance program. That's one of the things that's changed in the last few years. And I talked about the people who talk about economic models don't favor building good software. I don't actually agree with that. And I got so kind of tired of listening to that argument that I think the last time I spoke, which was at a assurance forum, I got up and said, contrary to popular belief, there is no actual evil vendor cabal by which vendors sit around and think about how they can build crummy software, charge more for it, and leave their customers' systems at greater risk longer. That really doesn't happen. In fact, quite the contrary, that certainly the large vendors, and I think more small ones, actually do focus on how can we do better. It doesn't make us perfect. No one will stand up and say we're perfect. But our goals have been, in particular my goals for my group have been, I don't want to be the big empire in Oracle because it's not effective. Hiring more and more policemen is not necessarily going to make our developers do things better. I don't want to be the code cops. But what I do want to do is make it easy for them to do the right thing, meaning tools, training, processes. That doesn't mean, by the way, that there aren't recalcitrant individuals who don't occasionally think it's not important. But if you create an environment where management believes it's important, it's reinforced, you make it easy for people to do the right thing, I think most developers will do the right thing, particularly when you have other incentives in place. And what does that mean? One of the discussions I had at breakfast, someone was asking me about, how do we do things in QA? I said, well, we do have groups in Oracle. We don't have one QA group because we have such a large, so many lines of business. But one of the things that we do, there's a group called, they're groups of individuals who just fix defects. Many organizations operate that way. But when it comes to security defects, we have the original developers go back and fix it. So why do you do that? Well, it's not per se to be punitive. It's not like, oh, you screwed it up the first time, I'm going to make you pay. But we want developers to understand the impact of their actions. And part of the impact is you need to understand that because you or maybe you inherited the code from someone else, didn't do this properly, there is a cost to our business of having to go back and re-engineer something. And that's another way, a reason to do it is so they understand why it was broken and how to cure it. Because it's another, in a way, it's another training opportunity. But yes, it does have an impact when you realize someone says, well, I'd love to go off and build this cool new feature, which is fun and hot technology, but I have to now remediate something because I didn't do the job right the first time. So yes, it is motivating. The other thing we want to do is to develop consistency across the entire product stack. When my team was sort of first formed, we focused on sort of our core tech stack products, the Oracle database. You know, we're not, by the way, just a database company. We have beaucoup products, thousands. Database, middleware, kind of the core technical underpinnings of the rest of our stack. And as time has worn on, you know, we wanted to be more consistent across the company. If we're doing something good in how do we build software, let's do the same good things everywhere. But also, we keep growing by acquisition. You know, some of you may have heard we bought a little company called Sun. That is probably the biggest. I have this visual of a boa constrictor swallowing an elephant and having to, you know, kind of digest it. It's a very large company to swallow, but that is not by any means the only company that we acquired. So when we do acquire a company, one of the things we try to do is to say, well, pretty quickly, what are they doing in terms of their assurance processes? How are they engineering security into their products? And by the way, we don't always assume that we're doing everything perfectly and nobody else does anything well. We look at, is there something good that someone's doing we could copy and make a broader program. But one of the things we want to do is to align people with our assurance processes pretty quickly. And I'll talk a little bit more about this particular story later, but one of the conversations that I've had recently with a customer I don't really want to have again had to do with, oh, you bought this company how long ago? And I've looked at their security and I don't think it's, you know, it's your brand now. This is not what I expect from you. I expect better. And they're right. So once your brand is on it, you know, you have to, it has to, you know, just, there's a certain expectation that goes with that. We like to think there is. And you want it to be a positive expectation, not a negative one. So we want to bring those acquisitions into our assurance processes as quickly as possible. The other thing we try to do is, I said, I don't want to be the security cops. We try to build expertise in each group. Security expertise, as I'm sure most of you know, is not that easy to come by. So I can either try to build the big empire where I have a group of 300 people, woohoo. Or I could say that I will never ever have enough people to look over the shoulders of every single developer and make sure they're coding properly, or every single QA person, or every single product manager. It is far better to try to get that expertise seated in development. I used to call it kind of the conversion model. You know, originally there were Rabbi Yeshua and his group of disciples, and they went out and converted the heathen. And then we have this whole new religion growing up. Well, it's sort of the same thing. You want development groups to understand the religion of secure coding, and the only way to do that is to kind of send people out into the heathen lands and convert them. And we also want to preserve our core corporate culture. In other words, you know, we do have bright, talented, motivated developers, and you want to preserve the culture and the autonomy they have to a certain extent. And part of that means that we don't do cookie cutter. One of the things we did recently, we have this a release checklist, which started out, it sounds strange to say this, but it started out where I was a product manager on the Oracle database, and 2 releases in a row, someone called me up to say, about 5 minutes before they cut the gold CD master, the file permissions on the executable are set to 777, is that okay? No, or why are you calling me now? Why didn't you figure this out earlier? So I said, okay, I'm gonna create a checklist. Most of you, anybody here have young children? All right, so I'm sure that before you send them off to school, do you have your lunch? Do you have the permission slip? Do you have your backpack? All those little things. Same thing for when we release product. We started a security checklist. And we do that now for every release, and as time has gone on, that's tied back to our coding standards. Now it's online and automated, and it's back to my point about entrepreneurial culture. It is tailored differently for different development groups. Well, why is that? Because not all groups are the same. And what a surprise. Now we're a hardware company. Hardware, not same thing as software. So we had to be tailored differently, so you don't have a developer coming back and saying, how come you're asking me this really dumb question that has absolutely no applicability to my organization? That's harassing, and it is. So you want to make things applicable and give them autonomy. And then the other key thing is oversight. I'm very pleased to say that I do not, in general, have to escalate things. But I have had to do it, and the fact we have a structure in place that makes it easy for me to do it, and if you don't have that, you're in a really bad position. I've actually told my team, I said, if we're focused on something that we think is important and management doesn't think it's important, if they're not worried, we shouldn't be. And if we are worried about it and it's a business thing that's worth worrying about, then management should support us, and they will support us. But if you don't have that if you have that mismatch, you're not going to get anywhere in trying to put security in your development organization. It's not going to work. And it's a very frustrating job. Fortunately, I don't have that problem. So why is it a corporate level concern? Because the business impact of somebody not getting it doesn't just affect their group, it affects other people in the company. So for example, as I've unfortunately found out sometimes, if you have a defect and you didn't handle it well or it's significant, there are other costs that will be incurred by other people, not just the developer. And by the way, I am not ignoring customer concerns here, but this is just to the rest of the company. So other organizations, QA, support doesn't like getting lots of phone calls. When are you going to fix this? How long has it been out there? Legal, all these other people. And if you don't do something well, then you have to go through like a PR fire drill, and no one wants to do that. Potential lost revenue or deferred revenue. Business risk for Oracle because, again, we run our own business, our own software. Actually, I've used that to my advantage. So a few years ago, I had one development group. There was a particular security issue, and the question was somebody going to fix it? It was Q4. They wanted to ship their product. They wanted to recognize revenue. I totally get that. But it was a significant defect. And I said, okay, here's the deal. So I went to the IT department and said, okay, guys, and by the way, we do not, by policy, share information with them about vulnerabilities in our own products as a general rule. We treat everyone the same. In this case, I went to them and said, okay, here's a particular defect. The discussion is whether we should fix it before it ships. You, the IT department, are the first customer for this. Would you take the product if you knew about this? Would you deploy it? Hell no. All right, so I wasn't entirely surprised at that, but I went back to development and said, look, just so you know, this is not an abstract academic discussion. This is a live customer. They would not take this risk. And by the way, if you ship the product like that in Q4, what are you really telling customers? We wanted your money. We had a hole big enough to drive the QE2 through. We hoped you wouldn't notice. Now, we're not that kind of company. We don't really treat customers that way. Is that really the message you want to send? Oh, no, I guess not. Yes, I know, I guess not. And by the way, I knew we would do the right thing, but it was helpful to remind people what are our corporate values, and you can't put a customer at risk. So yes, it's a business risk. It would have been a business risk for IT and any other customer. And frankly, a single product team can actually damage the rest of your brand, the rest of your reputation. So this is true in a lot of other areas of business. When people talk about, what are our core ethics or integrity, somebody shouldn't be allowed to make a business decision that puts the rest of their business at risk with impunity. And that's why you have oversight, and that's why you do have corporate values, and that's why you have to stand up for them. So the few times I've really had to escalate something, it has been because I think this, product X or product X's management does not get to put the rest of the company at risk because they choose not to think security is important. It damages everyone else. So what kind of oversight do we have? Well, lucky for me, I used to be in a development organization, which I really liked. But the problem with that was when I would try to say, here's our, what we're doing in assurance, the other product divisions would say, well, you're in that division, I don't have to listen to you. So I actually, a few years ago, was pulled out of development and I worked for the chief corporate architect, which means that my group, by the way, our chief corporate architect works for Larry Ellison. So, hey, when people see you're higher on the chop chain, they return your phone calls faster. But it means that when we put policies in place for how do we build software, how do we handle vulnerabilities, the standards that we have around secure development are corporate level. They're not just one product division. So that makes my life easier. We have an oversight committee that looks at security, multiple security, not just product security, across all our lines of business. So it's everything from regulatory requirements to business risk and security. But it has lines of business owners, legal, marketing, PR, physical security, and it's chaired by the corporate architect and one of our co-presidents. So it doesn't really get any higher than that. And we meet twice a year, and we look at business risk issues across the entire company. Now, it turns out that tends to be a very good forum to raise things. And sometimes it's, hey, look at the good things somebody has done, but it also can be, here's a risk to our business, and here's what we recommend. And having just been in one of these meetings recently, when one of your presidents says, this is what's going to happen, and their line of business owner is there just isn't much more discussion than that. It's kind of discussion over. So we don't need to see the structure chart. So in terms of how we implement this program, talk a little bit about our structure. So I have a small, well, I guess it's a decent sized team. But in each major development organization, we have a security lead. And also within that, for example, what would that be? Like we call server technologies. It's the group that builds the core database and related technologies. So we have a security lead. There are also boatloads of products or components within that major product area, and we have security points of contact within each product component. Now I mentioned that those SPOCs, everybody's got pointy ears. They originally were the people who filled out the release checklist, but that doesn't seem like a great job, does it? Go to MIT, get a master's degree, fill out checklists. No, nobody wants to do that job. But what they actually are is the first line of defense in development, because again, I don't want 20,000 developers calling up my chief hacking officer and asking him questions about how can you break products. That doesn't seem like a very scalable model. So taking those points of contact and making them not only the front line of defense, but giving them special training, special skills. We have a summit for them where we kind of brain dump what we know about building secure software, and frankly, why it matters to customers and why it matters in terms from a regulatory standpoint. So we meet with them regularly, and we also use the security leads to bootstrap security and acquisitions. What does that mean? When we buy these companies, frequently we incorporate them into an existing line of business. Now the good news is they will inherit a lot of the development processes of that group just by osmosis. But we also use those security leads to help us reach out to those acquisitions and say, what are you doing, what are you not doing, and using them to help, again, to help that alignment that I talked about. We also have a regular steering committee which sort of focuses on engineering solutions to common problems. And now we've started an assurance steering committee. Again, why do we do this? Because we don't think that my group is the repository of geniuses. If somebody has done something that's successful in another group, we want to make sure that that becomes common knowledge or common lore. And that could be everything like we use static analysis tools, which is some of you who've used them know it's not always the easiest thing to roll them out. How do you be successful with that? So when you find something that works, you want to replicate that. And one of the ways to seed that kind of information sharing is to get together and talk once in a while. So we do that on a more formal basis and try to institutionalize best practice. I mentioned the SPOCs are the security experts within each product group, and we really can't, this has been a success area, we really cannot do our jobs without them, because it's the difference between my small group trying to reach tens of thousands of developers and having people in those groups who know what they're doing. And I talked a little bit about how they report on their compliance. I'll skip that. Well, maybe I should back up a little here. So the things that my group, I haven't talked about the particular components of assurance, but this is a quick little run through. So, how do we do what we do? We have secure coding standards that we are kind of the bedrock for what we do. Now, by the way, I kind of started those, and I started those in a very small way by deciding I was really tired of explaining to developers, this is a few years ago, what a buffer overflow was and how to prevent it. Like, didn't you get this in computer science? Wrote up one page, what is a buffer overflow? Second page, how to avoid it. And that is now about 300 and some pages. Now, we don't expect developers to read 300 pages and commit them to memory. That isn't going to happen. But what we do is we give them training, and it's tied around that because it's pretty much where to go to look for answers. So they understand that these exist. And by the way, it's not just don't do this, it's how do you do this. If you want to handle this particular type of problem, what is our case law? What is our recommendations? What's the API you use? What is the correct way of doing something? And the one other thing we do, I occasionally get asked, why don't you publish these? One of the reasons we don't publish them is because one of the things that makes them effective is we have used examples, real-life coding examples from prior screw-ups. So needless to say, I don't want that published even though we fixed them. But the reason we do that is, and I'm sure some of you have had the same experience, you talked as a developer, that would never happen. No one would do that. It never happened to me. Well, yeah, it did. See that development group? See that code? That was the development group that's 2 floors below you. And let me tell you what it cost to fix that problem because they made that mistake. $1 million. So using real examples is more gripping to a developer than some abstract academic example in a manual. We train people on those. We have a number of we do formal certifications like FIPS and common criteria for certain products. We have customer-focused programs that also deal with assurance. One of the things my team is focused on now is to try to come up with more common modules for things. So if we have a common problem, let's look at coming up with an API for something or finding one instead of having everyone find their own way of solving the same problem. I have an ethical hacking team who works for me. They're quite scarily good at what they do. They're not actually, their job really isn't bug finding. I mean, they do that as a byproduct, but it's an extremely expensive way of finding defects in your software. So what their real job is actually knowledge transfer, because they are wickedly good at what they do, and I want them to be ahead of the research community. In fact, so that we know what the next type of attacks are, we can find those problems ourselves, we can develop a tool or coding technique or something that will help remediate that across the company before it becomes a huge problem. So how do we monitor security compliance? We have a bunch of metrics around what we do. I'll show you a chart in a minute. But basically they're focused, some of them are quantitative, like I mentioned the coding class, how many people have actually completed it. By the way, that number changes fairly frequently as we buy a new company, some new group gets rolled into a development organization, somebody moves, changes jobs. It'd be nice to say that everyone gets trained and that it stays at 97%, but that number actually fluctuates. The bug backlog by severity. The qualitative metrics have to do with how far along and how sophisticated people are in terms of some of our assurance measures, like using automated tools. And with that, let me step back a little. So there are all these different things we do. And one of the things we realized a few years ago is nobody could answer the question, who's doing what by development group? Now you'd like to think that there was a snappy answer to that, but there wasn't. So one of the guys who works for me came up with basically a scorecard. And part of that was so we could answer that question. And we realized that one of the things that could be really useful for is actually, first of all, reporting to management. How well are we doing? Do we do what we say we do across the company? How fast? When we bring a company in, how quickly are they going up that assurance curve? Are they doing things the way that we would expect them to do? So we score sort of by category, all the things that we do, how far along are they? And it's not necessarily pass fail. Who are the, and by product division with the owners. So we prepare that. By the way, this is not a gotcha exercise. When we do this, we do it roughly twice a year, sometimes more frequently. We review those cells with the particular business unit. Because the last thing you want to do is send a report up to management where something was wrong. The goal here is not per se putting people on report. It's showing us as a company how are we doing and how far have we come. But the fact that it gets distributed to the president and our chief executive officer, let's just say we use that to marketing advantage. Okay, we're planning on reporting these numbers to senior management in 2 months. And by the way, your numbers don't look so good, so now is your chance. Here's an opportunity to look better. So if you're not doing something, you should be doing it. The next 2 months would be a good time to get with the program. And so this is an extract. Notice that the names have been changed to protect the guilty, because again, my point here was not which product divisions haven't done what. This is what it looks like. So you can see all the different things that we say we do and how far in compliance is somebody. And over time, you want the whole thing to go green, meaning we're doing the right sorts of things. Now, by the way, we don't rest on our laurels here. One of the things we do with this is As time wears on, we know more about what good development practice is. We may have other tools that we use. There may be additional things that we choose to add to this. So we don't think of this as go green, we can all retire. Not there's anything wrong with green, it's Earth Day. But over time, you know the things there are things that you'll have to do differently and better in the future. So it is in a way hitting a moving target. But we do this, again, the goal of the moving target is not to harass development. It's to say there's something new that we should be doing that's widely recognized as best practice, that's effective, that helps us build better software and do better cost avoidance. So for example, we score how many people have completed training. One of the things that we look at is automated test tools. So it can't really be pass-fail because different development groups have different tool usage. Not all tools are useful for all groups. And just the fact that you bought something and installed it doesn't give you a green, right? And you want people to be using it to be sophisticated, cleaning up and fixing things appropriately. Okay, so when we report this, it comes not only with what does green, red, and yellow mean. As I mentioned, we do review it. We make sure that the people who run the lines of business see this before the chief executive does. Now, why do we do that? I don't want anyone to get a phone call from our chief executive going, I see that you're blah, blah in this cell. What do you know about this? The last thing you want to do, the goal here is not putting people on report, although I've used it for that. It's so that everybody knows where we are and everyone's looking at the same scorecard. And in particular, we always try to give people a chance to improve something before we go to the executives. I can't wait to get to the slide with story where I talk about how we did this. Okay, one other thing we do, and then I'll get to my stories. So from time to time, I talked about our Oversight Committee. When we have those, occasionally something will get raised as a particular area of interest, meaning, well, we have a problem here, so we will do particular focused metrics around that that we will report back to our executives. One of them had to do with secure coding training. I'll talk about that in a minute. And another one, which we've now institutionalized, is what we call an M&A alignment. Well, what does that mean? We realized that when we bought a company, we wanted to bring them into alignment quickly. So part of the way to do that was to come up with a really quick sort of checklist where we could survey what are they doing, what are they not doing, and we could use that to drive a compliance plan. So then we now institutionalize that. So within, as soon as we buy a company, we have plugged into our 100-day process, which means that we're getting some of these assurance items done or institutionalized a lot faster, and we score that. And that's another way to help reinforce our culture. But we initially did that just as a one-off exercise for management. So let me talk about the training, because this is a success story. We had a requirement for secure coding training for several years. And when I say requirement, I meant requirement. Almost everybody in development had to take it. And this is a source of arguments. I'm a product manager. Why do I need to take this? I don't write code. Because it goes to our core values, what the requirement is, and product managers actually have a fair say on what goes into a product and how it gets done. So everybody was supposed to have to take it. Maybe doc writers didn't, but pretty much anyone else, if you touched code, wrote code, worked on code, code got waved under your nose, you had to take this class. And it was online, it was modularized, and still there were people who found reasons not to take it. It's like having a baby or getting a new puppy. There is never a good time to do it. Just deal with it. And yet we couldn't get groups to do it. So finally, and by the way, the little color-coded thing didn't work so well. So finally, one of the guys who worked for me decided he was going to do a bar chart. And I told development groups, we're going to report this back to management, senior management has very pointed comments. In 2 months, you've had a couple of years to do this, get on with it, get your numbers up. Now, some of the development groups took that as an opportunity, and they went back and exhorted, they said, we need to do this, they made compliance. Some of them, as you'll see from this chart, this is what I reported before, and this is after I gave them 2 months' notice. This is what I reported to senior management. Now, I can tell you what the exact conversation went like, because nothing shows how what you're doing or not doing compared to your competitors like a bar chart. So one of the executives looked at this. See that group that's down around 38%? Quote, that is not right. They can all come in over the weekend to take that class, or they can look for new jobs. So once the word got out that someone was really concerned about this, what a surprise, because I went back and said some people weren't very happy with this. Within about, I'd say 4 months later, it was actually more like about 6 weeks, because once the word got out that somebody was really interested in this, they got with the program. Now, it shouldn't have taken that, in my opinion. And by the way, more on this group, the 38% group, more on them later. Looks good, doesn't it? By the way, we didn't just adjust the bar so it looks nice. They actually did complete this, all right? So I didn't fudge the numbers. So, again, we have centralized policy. We distribute enforcement down through individual groups. And that kind of get back to, I mentioned one group. Let me back up a little bit. We can institutionalize this, and we really try to. And I mentioned we try to make it easy for people to do the right things. It still gets back to someone has to choose to do it. So you can lead a horse to water, you can't necessarily force them to drink. And that actually does create a challenge. I'm sure a lot of you have. What do you do when somebody just didn't get it? You try to create these structures that will force them to get it, but ultimately someone has to choose to do it, or someone has to force them to do it. I really hate to see it get to that point. But the goal here, in most cases, this has worked well. We've had security leads who were very entrepreneurial. As I mentioned, the training numbers. Most of the leads use as an opportunity to go out to their groups and exhort them to do this and get their management backing. And if they had trouble getting management backing, which was almost never the case, then I would go to their senior executives and say, this is really important, I appreciate your support. But occasionally, you have problems where someone doesn't do this. Now, this structure in general works well. You know, we understand, particularly that no one does everything perfectly. They don't do it overnight. We give people time to do it. We give them support to do it. I always view it as, I tell my team, I do not assume malice or incompetence if there's another explanation. Meaning, if somebody is having a difficulty, and we now actually have found I'll talk about this in a minute. If someone is struggling, we try to find a way to bring them into alignment by giving them kind of remedial help. And if sometimes that means I'll go to their management and say this is very important, maybe they need more resources, to try to, again, support a group, not just beat them up. And this works well. I don't think a model where you have a central security group or the experts and you become the bottleneck. I've told my team repeatedly, my goal in life is is in a way to be out of a job because we get so good at this. They don't need us anymore, or we move into strictly a compliance role where there's so much expertise and development that very little has to come back to us. That is the only scalable way to do it. Yeah, and I think it works well. And there will still be a role for compliance to make sure that we're doing the right thing, but we'll be less hands-on and much more. Are we just taking temperature of are we doing the right things? So we have a small group that actually supports a very large development organization. And getting larger all the time as we make acquisitions. So, case study. This is a discussion I don't really want to have with a customer. I mentioned this earlier. So we had it was an unpleasant conversation with a customer about a particular product. By the way, they had already experienced IP intellectual property exfiltration. Had nothing to do with us, by the way. But needless to say, if you've had your intellectual property taken out of your network, let's say they were a little sensitive about security, and who can blame them? So they were very security aware. They had looked at one of our products. They were not happy, to say the least. I'll spare you the rest of the details, with sort of the security worthiness of the product. And their comment was, look, it's your brand now. We expect more from you. You know, who can argue with that? So I took this as an opportunity. I thought, well, what can I do to go back to them besides just say we're working on it? So what we did is we looked at their scorecard, had this group scorecard, and what I originally wanted to do in the interest of transparency, I wasn't going to give them a copy of our scorecard because that's an internal thing, but I thought, well, okay, I'll write out what this group is doing and not doing. At least know what's being done and not done. And as I'm starting to write this out, I'm saying, you know, this doesn't look very good to me. They should do more. Why aren't they doing more? So we looked at it, and I said, you know, I'm now uncomfortable enough, I will take my resource, my ethical hacking team, and with the product team's permission, we scheduled an ethical hack. So they looked at it to say the least. They ripped it. And we took that and we created a cure plan. So the cure plan didn't just include fix this bug, the ethical hacking team. We looked at what is it going to take? This team seems to be struggling with making compliance with what does it mean to be an Oracle product. They're not getting with the assurance program. We created an aggressive cure plan to take that trajectory, you're not getting it, to move it up to, what would it take for them to be back on the trajectory. And we rank ordered them. And again, we didn't just say, do everything 2 weeks from now, you've got to be done. But said, you need to get with the program, this is your cure plan. I made sure we ran it by the people in the business, and then I went to escalate it to their line of business owner. At this point, the person who ran that particular business unit said, well, I don't want you to do that. I said, well, I understand this, but this is to help you. The executive I'm escalating this to is very supportive of security. Next to my boss, the most supportive person. Whenever I've gone to him and said, there's a problem, here's what I recommend, he's on it. This is to help you. Well, I don't want you to do that. He used that as an opportunity to go to his boss, this gentleman I referred to, and meet with him separately. Well, good for him, but why did it take that? And then I took that and I reported again to our Oversight Committee. So what's the takeaway from this? I looked and said, this is a product that needed to get in alignment. We created a plan for them to do that. I gave this person every opportunity to do it. The real problem here was he didn't think it was important. Now, I will tell you, at that meeting, it was reiterated to him in words of one syllable by executives that that wasn't acceptable. This was very important. Security is part of our brand. Absolutely critical. So for whatever reason, this person thought that this wasn't important to our business. When one of the highest executives in the company reiterates this is critical to our business, what's the takeaway? I don't think that he had to get it, because it was now reiterated by your boss's boss's boss. This is it. This is part of our core value as a company. So it's a little, it's good, because when I told my team is we did this the right way. It's not just what you do, it's how you do it. My goal here isn't to put somebody on report, and it wasn't. And it wasn't personal. That guy's being mean to me. He's not doing it. This is our business. It's important to us. One team, for whatever reason, can't choose to opt out of something that's a core business value. Not just a value, but it would affect all our customers and our brand if this isn't done right. And to get back to this particular customer, I didn't like the fact that it was kind of an unpleasant customer. And it was certainly an unpleasant conversation. But they weren't wrong about the core thing. We expect better from you. And they're right. And they deserve better. And the other thing I did with this is to say, after we had this meeting, I can go back to that customer and say, you know what, you're right. Here's what we've done. And we escalated to the highest level of the company. That doesn't mean we're going to be perfect overnight. It has been reiterated. And we put a cure plan in place. Because I don't want to have that conversation with them again. And I particularly don't want to have it 6 months later after they raise their concerns. You don't want to go back to somebody and say, I feel your pain, but we didn't do anything. All right, that's not the conversation to have. So what else did we take away from this? Well, now we have a problem child program. And problem child means when we look at, we review all the things that people are doing and not doing. If we see a team struggling for whatever reason, we try to give that group much more focused attention earlier. And I've actually asked for resource for this. And why is it? It's kind of a dilemma. We build new products, we make acquisitions. You want everyone to be green, so to speak, everyone to be on the right trajectory, but you can't always get there overnight anyway. And if you see somebody who's really struggling, I would rather get ahead of that than have that turn into an unpleasant conversation with a customer, because we should have been all over that. And there are, a couple of groups that we track as problem children. That means we put a cure plan in place. We try to be very aggressive. We take our hacking team. We hack the product. What can you do to help somebody, get right? So last thing, I want to make sure I don't run over my time here. Now we put all this structure in place. What do you do with that? Well, we don't necessarily look for more worlds to conquer, but as it turns out, there is another world to conquer. And one of the things is, for some of you who may go to other conferences where they talk about assurance, the new thing is supply chain risk. And it's hard to understand sometimes what people mean by that, because it sort of means, it's like cloud, it means different things to different people, depending who you're talking to. But one of the main things that people are concerned with is, and understandably, at least the customers, I want to know that if I get a product from, my supplier, first of all, I want to make sure that it actually isn't counterfeited or doesn't have counterfeit pieces in it. But the other thing I want to know that people are worried about, I'm worried that somebody someplace, some foreigner, could put something bad in the code base, and the bad in the code base gets into your code, and the next thing you know, there's a kill switch. And I'm not making fun of this because, it goes back to, if you build something, you want to know of what it's made, how it's made, have good controls and assurance over it through its life cycle. So I'm not poo-pooing the concern at all. And the fact that people may be, doing things in multiple locations or pulling code from multiple sources is like another iterant of an assurance problem. Now, businesses' supply chain risks are something a little different. So what do businesses worry about? Yes, some of that is what I just illustrated. But some of it has to do with intellectual property protection. So for example, if someone downloads a library, depending if it has a viral license and it gets into your code base and you have to give away all your products, not so good. So businesses are worried about some of the same things, but some that are different. But at the end of the day, what you want to be able to do is to tell a story. And the story you want to tell, because a lot of people, particularly the Defense Department, is worried about supply chain risk, is to sit down and have a conversation like this. I understand what your concerns are. Here are the things we do. Here are the things that we're concerned about in terms of supply chain risk. Here's the following 12, 15, 30, whatever it is. Here are the things, controls, the processes, the controls, policies we have in place to address those things. And we've actually done a gap analysis. What were we worried about? What is it that you need to do to meet that particular threat? We've looked at where we weren't doing something. And we also institute this across our lines of business. So we make sure that regardless of what product we're putting together, hardware, software, we have consistent ways of mitigating against these prevailing threats. That's the story you want to be able to tell. It's not just assurance, but it sounds a lot like this program I was just illustrating to you. And the other reason you want to be able to tell a story is you have people in Washington trying to, everybody, this is the new thing. If you want a new gravy train, it's supply chain risk. Everybody's got a conference, everybody's proposing standard. There are all kinds of people who want to work on how can I come up with a structure for this. So if you want to talk to legislators about here's what's reasonable and feasible, here's what would actually work, here's the fact that businesses have slightly different concerns than customers, you need to be able to tell a story. And part of the way you tell a story is by talking about what your own institution does. Here's what my company does. Here's what's reasonable and feasible and achievable. So this is a leverage opportunity for us because there's enough overlap here between assurance and supply chain that the existing compliance model we put in place is something we can now adapt. So I didn't set up a program like this, and I can't even say I did. The people who work for me did 98% of what I've just talked about. But we can take what we've done that's been successful and use it for another purpose, which means we're justifying our existence. So what is the conclusion? Part of the reason I didn't just wake up and say, working on less buggy software isn't cool enough anymore. I have to say governance. I want governance in my title. But the reason we did this is because the company, when I first joined Oracle, so 22 years, I was 8 at the time. I'm sticking with that. We keep growing, and it's a combination of the world has changed. The world has changed for us because of the way that we grow. It's far more regulated. If any, part of my collateral duties have been reviewing a seemingly endless procession of proposed bills on cybersecurity. And it's not that I'm afraid of regulation per se, but we just want whatever is done to be achievable, reasonable, and focused. But it is more regulated. Much more awareness of security. When I started in this, there was no, people didn't even call it assurance unless you worked on security evaluations. There weren't conferences. Almost everybody's aware of this, and every time you open the paper, there's another, the New York Times had, and the Washington Post had articles, major articles about cybersecurity, virtually every week. More interdependencies, because everybody runs on a cyber backbone now. And frankly, there is a much more compelling argument for governance because you want to make sure that you're doing things consistently. And by the way, if we get to a model of transparency or things actually do get regulated, you need that kind of structure to be able to support it. I need to be able to say to one person, okay, great, here's a single source of truth about what we do and don't do. It's lower cost for the company. People say, well, how do you justify this? I said, it's all cost avoidance. It is all cost avoidance. It's cost avoidance to us because of thousands of products. We run on, Oracle database runs on 19 operating systems, and there's probably 6 versions in support. How expensive do you think it is to fix a single defect? Really bloody expensive. Patching costs. More and more customers are coming back and saying, I want to know what you did and didn't do. I want you to have a third party look at your code. Reinforces our brand, and it is really all about leverage. Everything that we do is focused on how do we make something that is achievable, that lowers our costs, if we do it in a repeatable way. And we can prove that to the satisfaction of ourselves first, but also to customers. And for that, you need a governance structure. It can't just be a bunch of good people trying to do the right sort of things. So that's all I had. I'll be very happy to take questions. I know you're all going to run home and say, I want a governance structure. But if you're a company of any size, you need to have some proof in the pudding. It can't just be your marketing brochures. And I'll tell you, that scorecard truth doesn't lie. When we actually go through that, we find out very quickly who's getting right with the Lord and who isn't, and how fast. No questions. That's scaring everybody. You need more coffee. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, it is. In fact, even with the discussion I talked, I won't say that I took this person to the woodshed. I really had tried to get this group to do the right thing. But one of the things I did, even when I went to the Oversight Committee, is there were actually a couple different lines of business within that big group. And one of them had a security lead who was awesome. And I always made a point of going back and saying, Joe Schmo is doing a great stuff, very cooperative, reinforcing. So I really try to do it in a positive way. When somebody's doing something great, whether it's sending an email note to them and copying their management, I really try to do that. I don't only say so-and-so is being mean to us and not doing the right things. I try to specifically call out people who are doing the right things, because their management doesn't always know that. So do I personally hand out, bottles? Actually, I've done that. Occasionally will give somebody a bottle of scotch or something, whatever their vice is. But I also try to acknowledge people who are doing the right sorts of things, because they need that. Yes? Funny you mention that. We do get pulled into. I don't necessarily directly get pulled into M&A, but in other words, when they're thinking about an acquisition. But there are things that we have done to try to help seed that. So, for example, there's a group that does an awful lot of due diligence. One of the things that we did is to offer them some. In fact, I just had a discussion about this, that it needs to be sort of revved. The types of questions they should ask to make that determination. So we seeded here's the type of things you should look at as part of an acquisition. It's not that security has to be the only thing you would look at, but if you're going to look at it, here are the things you should check out. Occasionally, there's been a request, and I stayed out of it because I don't have these skills, to use my ethical hacking team to look at a product. And let me tell you, anybody who's met our chief hacking officer, he's very good at what he does and very pithy. So he will usually use words of one syllable in expressing how secure or insecure a product is. But we have done that as part of due diligence. We don't always do it, but they are called in from time to time. And again, I think in at least one case, it was that security assessment was a particularly critical fulcrum to make kind of a go or no go decision. I don't know the particulars, because we're very, I'm not in the M&A loop at that stage of it. Usually just after we've already bought somebody. But we do use security sanity checks. Yes? Well, you're right. I didn't want to be too glib about that. So what I meant was, you don't want to be so good at fixing bugs that you forget that you're supposed to be avoiding them in the first place. That would have been a better way to say that. So we do. Yes, I should say something about fixing bugs, because in a way, you want to get good at it to the point where customers trust you. And this is kind of an educational process. So when we work with research, not all fact, most of the bugs that we find are, the vast majority are found by us. Something like 87% at least across the whole company. I mean, I'm not looking at a particular, we find ourselves. Now, having said that, when a researcher reports something, we have processes in place to make sure that we communicate back on a regular basis and try to be professional about it. Because again, if you're rude to the research community, that will get you sometimes in trouble pretty quickly. But one of the things we do is to try to, and I don't mean educate in a pejorative way, but we explain to them. So one of the debates you have in industry is, well, I reported this 3 days ago, you should fix that